Colorado Territory, June 1872. The sun beat down hard on the dusty main street of Delaney Ridge, where a crowd had gathered in uneasy silence. The wooden sign above the sheriff's office creaked in the hot wind, and the auction block stood like a gallows in the center of it all. A woman stood on it, her baby wrapped tight against her chest, her chin lifted but her eyes hollow. "They are auctioning her off?" Thomas Ellery asked, his voice low, incredulous. He had come into town for nails and a new saddle cinch, leading his dapple gray mare with a quiet gait. But now he stood still, boots planted in the dirt, fists clenched at his sides. "Widow," a man beside him muttered. "Her husband died 3 weeks ago. No family, no land. Sheriff says she has no means to care for the boy." Thomas's jaw worked. "So they're selling her." "Not in so many words. They're calling it placing her under care. She gets handed off to whoever bids the most to take her in. Her and the baby." Thomas looked back toward the platform. She was young, maybe 22, maybe less. Her dress was faded and patched, her face pale, but her spine was straight like a fence post. That baby, maybe 6 months old, had a tuft of auburn hair poking from the blanket. The woman held him like he was the only thing that mattered. The sheriff barked, "All right, folks. Widow and child. One healthy woman, good with sewing and laundry, baby strong, who'll take responsibility." No one moved. Heat shimmered above the earth. A horse stomped nearby. The baby made a soft, restless sound. "Come now, gentlemen. She cannot stay in the jail. We need a home for her and the boy." Still silence. Thomas stepped forward. "I will." Every head turned. The woman's eyes snapped to his. There was something fierce in them, fear maybe, or just exhaustion, but she held his gaze. The sheriff squinted. "You sure, Ellery? You live clear out past Pine Hollow. Alone, last I heard." "I have a roof. Land, I can feed them." The sheriff looked from him to the woman. "You know what this means, right? You take them in, they're your responsibility, she is under your protection. You put your name to it, you do not walk away." "I understand," Thomas said. The sheriff looked at the woman. "You got any objection, miss?" Her voice was quiet but steady. "No, if he is offering us a home, I will accept." Thomas stepped up to the platform and held out his hand. She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. "Name's Thomas Ellery," he said. "You and the boy, what are your names?" "Willow Emery," she said. "And this is Peter." Thomas tipped his hat. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Emery." She blinked fast, like she might cry, but then she nodded. They rode out of town that evening, the baby asleep against her chest and Thomas leading the way without saying much. Her small bundle of belongings was tied behind his saddle. The ride was quiet, hours long, and the sky turned gold and then lavender. When they reached his homestead, a cabin tucked among tall pines and grassland, Willow stared at it like it was a dream. "It is not much," Thomas said, dismounting and tying off his horse. "But it is warm and the roof holds." "It is more than we had," she murmured. Inside, he lit a lamp and showed her the space. One room, but clean. A bed in the corner, a cot near the stove, shelves lined with jars and folded linens. "You and Peter take the bed," he said. "I will sleep on the cot." "You do not have to, I want to," he said, not looking at her. "The boy needs you clothes." Willow sat on the edge of the bed and unwrapped Peter. He yawned, small fists waving in the air. Thomas watched her from the stove. "You hungry?" She nodded once. "I can help cook." "You rest," he said. "You have done enough today." He made beans and cornbread, and they ate in silence. She fed Peter while he chewed slowly, thinking how strange it was to have someone else at his table. He had lived alone for 4 years, ever since his brother died in a mining collapse and left him the land. He had not expected company, but he did not mind it. After they ate, Willow washed the dishes, and Thomas watched the way her hands moved, careful, practiced. She did not speak much, and neither did he. But when she turned to him and said, "Thank you," it hit him hard in the chest. "You do not owe me thanks," he said. "Yes, I do." She touched Peter's head. No one else stepped forward. He looked down, then back at her. "You and the boy deserve better than to be left standing on a block like cattle. That was wrong." Willow stared at him across the lamplight. "You did not even know us. Why did you do it?" Thomas swallowed. "Because you looked like you still had fight left in you. And I have seen too many people give up." She said nothing, but her eyes softened. That night, after she laid Peter down and curled beside him, Thomas sat by the hearth, poking at the fire. The room was quiet except for the crackle of logs and Peter's soft breathing. He glanced over. Willow was watching him. "I do not know what comes next," she said. "We figure it out," he replied. She nodded slowly, then turned and pulled the blanket over her shoulder. Thomas leaned back in the chair, staring into the flames, and felt something stir in his chest, something warm and unfamiliar. He had not planned on this. But maybe, just maybe, it was what he needed too. The sky broke open with rain 3 days later. It came sudden, hard and slanting, drumming against the cabin roof just after dusk. Thomas had been stacking firewood under the lean-to when the first drops hit, and by the time he got inside, soaked through and smelling of pine bark, Willow was rocking Peter near the stove, humming low. She turned when the door shut behind him, her braid loose over one shoulder, and something softened in her expression when she saw his shirt clinging wet to his arms. "There's a dry one in the chest," she said, not quite looking at him. "You'll catch cold." He toed off his boots and crossed to the chest without a word. The fire threw long shadows across the floorboards, and Peter's breath came soft and steady against his mother's collarbone. Thomas changed behind the door, then stepped back into the room, rubbing his hair dry with a cloth. Willow watched him from the rocker, eyes steady, uncertain. "I've been meaning to ask," she said, voice low, "what you did before you had this land." He knelt by the stove to tend the flames. "Freight wagon work, mostly. Hauled goods from Golden to Leadville. Then my brother found a claim near here and I left the road to help him. You stayed on after," he nodded once. "Didn't see the use in leaving it to rot." Willow looked down at Peter. "You ever think of going back to the wagons?" Thomas set the poker aside. "Sometimes. But I've had enough of dust and wheel ruts and strangers with short tempers." She nodded slowly as if weighing that answer. "What about you?" he asked, straightening. "Before." She didn't answer right away. The wind pressed hard against the shutters. "My husband worked for the telegraph station in town. He was steady, quiet. We had a room behind the office. I sewed for extra coin." She adjusted Peter's blanket. "After he passed, they let me stay 2 nights. Then said the space was needed for a new operator." Thomas leaned against the table's edge. "And your people died back in Illinois. Fever took my father, then my sisters. My mother never made it past Kansas." He didn't ask more. The silence held, not heavy, just present. Willow met his eyes. "You don't talk much, Mr. Ellery." "No need to use Mr.," he said. "Thomas is fine." "All right," she murmured. "Thomas, then." He shifted his weight, then nodded toward the cupboard. "There's flour and lard." "I was thinking biscuits for supper." She stood carefully, laying Peter in the cradle Thomas had pulled from the attic that morning. "I can make them." "You sure?" "I've been stirring dough since I could reach the table. I'll be quicker than you." He stepped back with a small lift of his hand. "Fair enough." She moved around the small space like she'd always belonged there, sleeves rolled, hair tucked back, measuring by feel. Thomas watched from the rocker now, his hands still, the firelight catching the side of his face. She glanced over once, flour on her knuckle. "Do you ever feel strange having someone else here?" He considered that. "No, feels right." She didn't answer, but he saw her shoulders ease. When the biscuits were done, They ate at the table, and Thomas asked about the hills she'd passed through on her way west, the names of towns she remembered. She told him about a man in Abilene who tried to sell her a broken sewing machine for the price of a mule, and he surprised them both by laughing. Afterward, she brought out a worn piece of stitching, something she'd started long ago. A line of blue thread wound across the fabric like the bend of a river. "I never got to finish it," she said. "I thought I might now." Thomas nodded, eyes on the neat, careful work. "Looks like it's worth finishing." Peter stirred, and Willow rose to lift him, cradling him against her chest. She paced slow, murmuring something too soft to hear. Thomas watched them, something unspoken settling in his chest like the first snow on a mountain slope, quiet, certain, and impossible to ignore. That night, as the rain eased and the wind softened, he lay on the cot listening to the soft rustle of willow shifting under the blanket, the occasional sigh from Peter. The dark had weight, but it was no longer empty. He stared at the ceiling, hands folded over his stomach, and thought of how the world could shift under you without warning. How sometimes, when it did, you found yourself standing in the right place after all. By the end of June, the high grasses around the cabin rippled with early summer wind, and the creek behind the rise ran clearer than Thomas had seen it in years. Willow had begun tending the patch of soil beside the shed, coaxing beans from the dry earth with nothing more than patience and the steady rhythm of her hands. Thomas spent most of the daylight hours mending fence down by the south field, the kind of work that didn't ask for words, just time and a good hammer. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the pines, Willow folded a worn blanket across the porch rail and said, "I'd like to earn my keep." Thomas glanced up from oiling his saddle. "You already do. I mean properly," she added, brushing a thread from her skirt. "Not just cooking or sweeping. I want something I can offer outside these walls." He set the cloth aside. "What are you thinking?" "I could take in mending," she said. "There's always a man with a torn cuff or a widow with no time to patch her boy's trousers. If I wrote to town, asked around quiet like I could have work brought here, folks wouldn't have to come far." He leaned back against the porch post, considering. "You'd need cloth, spare needles." "I'll manage." She looked past the trees. "I always have." He nodded once. "Then I'll ride in on Thursday. Leave a note with the general store." Willow's mouth turned up a little, not quite a smile, but close. That same night, as she rocked Peter to sleep, she asked, "Did you ever think about marrying?" Thomas was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the wind brushing through the chinks in the cabin wall. "I did once," he said, keeping his eyes on the wood grain of the table. "Year before my brother died. Her name was Ada. She lived 2 farms over. We were making plans." Willow's voice came softer. "What happened? She married someone else, a man with more acres. I didn't blame her." He exhaled slowly. "She wanted children. I didn't have much to offer back then." Willow tucked the blanket tighter around Peter and didn't speak. The silence between them felt different now, not empty, but full of things they both carried. The next morning, Thomas found her sitting on the porch steps with a handful of threadbare shirts spread across her lap. Peter was asleep inside, the door cracked to let in the breeze. "Those mine?" he asked, eyeing the pile. "They were once," she said, threading her needle. "Now they're barely holding together. Figured I'd stitch what I could." He lowered himself beside her, his knees creaking. "I didn't think you'd take to needlework again so fast." She looped the thread through the fabric with steady fingers. "It's not the sewing I mind. It was the feeling of being useful to someone who didn't see me." Thomas looked out toward the trees. "Is that how it was?" She gave a single nod. "Then I hope this place feels different." "It does," she said, without hesitation. The days stretched longer as July neared. Letters started arriving, small parcels of worn clothes left at the gate, sometimes with coins tucked into the pockets. Willow worked in the late afternoons, her stitches small and even. Thomas built a box with compartments for her thread and thimbles, and she ran her fingers over the smooth wood with a look he hadn't seen on her face before, something proud, quiet, and steady. One evening, as he came in from hauling water, he found her standing at the table, turning something over in her hands. "I found this in the root cellar," she said, holding up a small carved wooden horse. "Peter's big enough to hold things now. Thought he might like it." Thomas brushed his hands clean on his trousers. "That was my brother's doing. He made it for me when I was a boy. I'd forgotten it was still down there." Willow turned it gently, the corners of her mouth soft. "He must have cared for you, he did," Thomas said. "Even when I didn't make it easy." She set the horse down beside Peter's cradle. "I think Peter will care for it, too." That night, after the lamps were out and the fire had gone to coals, Thomas lay awake listening to the soft breath of the two people sharing his roof. He didn't know if it was love, yet not the kind written in letters or whispered under willows, but it was something with roots, something that didn't shake loose with the wind, and that, he thought, might be worth holding on to. By mid-July, the heat settled in deep, the kind that clung to skin and turned the air still. Crickets sang loud in the evenings, and the dirt path between the barn and cabin kicked up fine dust that clung to boots and hems. Thomas rose with the sun, as always, but now he found himself lingering inside a little longer, watching Willow braid her hair across one shoulder while Peter babbled to the rafters from his basket. One morning, she turned from the table with her sewing still in hand and said, "There's a woman in town, Mrs. Bramble, who used to run a school out of her parlor. I heard she's gone near blind this year." Thomas set down his tin cup. "You thinking of writing to her?" "I'm thinking of asking if she'd lend me her readers and slates," Willow said. "I only went through a few grades before we left Illinois, but I remember enough. I'd like to teach Peter myself, once he's older. And maybe any children near enough who can't get to town." He rubbed his thumb along the rim of the cup. "You've a mind for that kind of thing," she gave a small shrug. "I remember liking the quiet of it, words that meant something." "I want Peter to learn more than just how to split kindling." Thomas nodded slowly. "I'll ride in next week. Leave a note with her if she's still got kin in town." Willow watched him for a long second. "Thank you." He stood, lifting the water bucket from beside the door. "You don't have to thank me every time." She folded her sewing. "I know, I just want to." Later that week, a horse came lame down from the North Trail, and Thomas took it in from a neighbor who had no time for nursing animals. The gelding's front left hoof was cracked, and Thomas spent 2 days rasping and soaking it in a barrel while the sun burned his neck and the flies stirred around his shoulders. Willow brought him vinegar-soaked cloths for his arms and stood with Peter on her hip while she watched him work. "You talk to him like he's listening," she said once, as Thomas described the way the hoof should settle once reshaped. Thomas glanced up. "He don't understand the words, only the tone." Willow shifted Peter to her other side. "Still, I think he likes hearing your voice." Thomas leaned back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow. "You think that's rare?" "I think it's kind," she said. That evening he found a basin of cool water waiting on the porch with a clean scrap of cloth folded neatly beside it. No note, no name, just waiting. The next day they moved the cradle nearer the window so Peter could watch the birds settle on the fence posts. Willow set out a gathering basket and told Thomas she was walking toward the creek to see if the wild mint had come back. He offered to go, but she only said, "I'd like the quiet," and kissed Peter's forehead before wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. She was gone the better part of the morning, and when she returned, There was no mint in her basket. Only smooth stones, and a small bunch of red berries Thomas told her to toss before she made anyone sick. "I know," she said, laughing under her breath. "I only liked the look of them." He watched her sort the stones on the porch rail later that evening, arranging them from smallest to largest, then again by color. Peter sat in his lap, chewing on his fist and squinting at the light. The boy had begun to reach for things, his hands open and curious. "You always line things up like that?" Thomas asked, shifting Peter gently. Willow didn't look up. "Only when I'm thinking." "What about?" She paused, then tilted her head. "How a person can feel safe in a place without realizing it." Thomas's hand came to rest at Peter's back. "And do you?" She turned to face them, her eyes steady. "I think I'm beginning to." That night, she folded the blanket down over her legs and said, "You never ask me to do more than I offer." Thomas didn't move from his place by the hearth. "Wouldn't feel right. Most men I've known would have taken more by now. I'm not most men." She nodded once, not in praise but in quiet recognition. "No," she said, "you're not." The fire crackled low. Peter stirred in his sleep. Thomas stood, slow and quiet, and crossed to the cradle. He looked down at the boy for a long moment, then drew the quilt up around his shoulders. Willow's voice came soft behind him. "He sleeps easier here." Thomas didn't turn. "So do I." When he did glance over his shoulder, her eyes were still on him, not guarded, not asking, just seeing him. In that stillness, something shifted, not a new beginning, but a deeper settling of roots. Not spoken, not promised, but understood. The last of the summer rains passed in the night, leaving the earth damp and sweet. By morning, the air was clean enough to breathe deep, and the green of the hills stretched wide beneath a pale sky. Thomas stood at the edge of the corral, hammer in hand, watching the gelding shift weight from one leg to the other with more ease than he'd shown in weeks. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. "I mended your shirt," Willow said, stepping down the porch steps. "The one you wear when the weather cools." Thomas wiped his palms on his trousers and turned. "Didn't think it was cold enough yet. It will be soon." She stopped a few paces away, the shirt folded over her arm. "There was a tear behind the shoulder seam. I stitched it so it won't pull." He took it from her carefully, fingers brushing the fabric. "You always see what others pass over." "I saw the way you favor your right side when you work," she said. "Figured it came from something old." He nodded once. "Took a fall off a wagon slope, broke the collarbone clean through. It healed wrong." She looked up at him, eyes steady. "Does it still hurt?" "Only when the rain's coming." He paused. "And when I carry more than I ought." Willow tilted her head. "You seem the kind to carry more than most." "I used to think that was the only way to be," he said. "Now I think it's better with someone else beside you." She didn't answer right away, just watched the horse flick his ears toward the pine trees. "I've been thinking," she said finally. "If I'm going to teach, I'll need a space. The sewing takes up the table, and it's close quarters with Peter crawling now." Thomas followed her gaze to the shed. "We could clear the back half. There's room if we move the tools." "I'd need light," she added. "The window in there's small." "I'll cut another pane," he said. "You can have that corner. Make it yours." She smiled, quiet and certain. "I'd like that." They spent the next week clearing shelves, hauling crates of old nails and bent tools out into the sun. Thomas worked beside her, shoulder to shoulder, and when he caught her brushing dust from her cheek with the curve of her wrist, he found himself smiling without reason. Peter sat in a basket of quilts, chewing on a wooden spoon and watching the world like it was all new. At dusk, Thomas lit a lantern and held it aloft while Willow arranged the table they'd moved into place. She laid out her slates and a stack of worn readers she'd fetched from town on her last trip. A small chalkboard leaned against the wall, its surface clean and waiting. "This room's warmer than I expected," she said, running her hand over the tabletop. "Sun hits it just right in the mornings," he replied. "You'll be comfortable here." She turned toward him, the amber light catching the curve of her jaw. "You've given me more than shelter. I haven't given you anything you didn't already deserve." Her eyes softened. "You never asked for anything in return. I didn't need to." She stepped closer then, so close he could feel the warmth of her skin beneath the cotton of her dress. "I want to give something now," she said, her voice low. "If you'll have it." He didn't speak, just reached out and brushed his fingers against hers, then let his hand settle over her wrist, feeling the steady beat below her skin. "I will," he said. She leaned into him, sure and slow, and he met her halfway. Their mouths came together with the weight of everything unspoken between them: grief, hope, quiet hours, long looks across lamplight. It was no rush, no claiming, just belonging. Later, with Peter asleep and the last of the lanterns dimmed, they sat side by side on the porch. Willow leaned against his shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her waist. "I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again," she said, her voice barely above the wind. "You are now," he answered. She turned her face toward his. "So are you." They married the following Sunday, beneath the tall cottonwoods near the East Ridge. No preacher, just two neighbors to witness and the wind in the grass as they spoke their vows. Willow wore a dress she'd let down at the hem, and Thomas gave her a ring carved from a coin he'd kept since boyhood. Peter gurgled against her hip, reaching for the leaves above them. They returned home to stew warming on the stove and a pie cooling on the sill. That night, Willow climbed into bed beside him without hesitation, drawing the quilt up over them both with a sigh that settled deep in her chest. Their days unfolded, slow and steady. Willow taught letters and numbers to the children of nearby settlers, 3 at first, then 6. Thomas added another stall to the barn, took in strays from the valley, and let Peter ride the gelding bareback with a loop of rope when he grew old enough to hold on. The cabin filled with small sounds: chalk scratching on slate, Peter's laughter, Willow humming while she worked. Evenings came with bare feet on porch boards and the hush of shared glances that said more than words ever could. And when storms rolled in from the west, shaking the shutters and rattling the roof, Thomas would reach for her hand in the dark, and she would take it without question. They never needed to explain what had come before. What mattered was the life they built after, together, always.